outset, I would like to thank our colleague, Christina Nakona, who is the true initiator of this project, as a project of the European Research Council, and who has been our guide, also our hope, for the 3 years since this all began. Now, Christina Nakona will tell you what it's all about in terms of philological subject matter, historical sources, and their development and interdependence. So, the work we are doing, all of us are doing every day. Myself, I would like to tell you what it's all about in terms of the wider scope of the history of these texts, why they're written and how they're written. So, to give you a tableau of Arabic Islamic Neoplatonism, much of which is based, of course, on this so-called theology of Aristotle. The perennial effort to establish order in the face of chaos, ever threatened by violent death, terrors of war, devastating epidemics, may be seen as the driving force behind the spiritual culture of the Middle Ages. To the philosophy, the question of cosmic order and of a global sense was an immediate and radical challenge. While living men tried by thinking to master their lives, they turned to time-honored authorities to help them cast their quest and their claims into the form of rational argument and demonstrable proof. From its first reception into Arabic Islamic society, the sciences and philosophy as the science of sciences are presented as demonstrative science, and as such defend their absolute claims, authority, and even power. What is a far-reaching, lasting consequence, and what even today provides a sense of unity among the civilizations emerging from 2 millenniums of intellectual activity around the Mediterranean, is the rise of demonstrative science as a safeguard of intellectual authority, eclipsing the nominal authorities of the ancient schools. Should I use this or shouldn't I?
No.
It's better. Yeah. Well,
doesn't it?
I try. It does, it seems to be. Despite of switch it on. Despite of contemporary Arabic Islamic protestations of spiritual identity and intrinsic otherness, I would like to insist on this common ground and this common language, the language of demonstration. Historians of philosophy tend to think about philosophies rather than about philosophy, differences rather than unity, change rather than continuity. Cultural critics, in their turn, oppose the claim of one tradition, one civilization, one religion of whichever side of the Mediterranean or of the Atlantic to represent universal values. Traditions and schools of thought which would seem to support such unity are denounced for being vestiges of cultural hegemonism, of colonialism, or of obeisant acculturation. Against such narrow-minded parochialism, common in East and West alike, I would like to insist on the rich testimonies of a continuity based on a millennium of epistemic community. It is one of the main purposes of this our project that such a community can be shown to exist until the present day. The religion, erudition, and science of Islam grew upon the soil of the Hellenized Mediterranean. From antiquity to late Hellenism and its reception in the Arabic Islamic milieu, from the teachers of Baghdad, Cordoba, and Isfahan to the Latin readers of Avicenna and Averroes, philosophy, moved between the two poles of Platonism and Aristotelianism. The paradigms of the one and the many, the essence in being, and the being of the essence in actual substances. In this way, the rational sciences, scientific pragmatism, and the global Weltbild of the Gnostic religion were imbued with the wisdom of Plato, transmitted, it is true, under the guise of Aristotle, also of Pythagoras, and some other prosopar of the ancient schools, and giving his name to irrational, nay, occult texts of the subculture of Oriental Hellenism. And they were renewed under the aegis of Aristotle's demonstrative science. From Plato, his Arabic heirs inherited the conviction that contingent being and sensible phenomena cannot convey but an imperfect perception of the true essences, and further, that the final goal of human existence, resulting in true felicity, can only be achieved by rational activity oriented towards knowledge of the good. From Aristotle, that is to say, from the Aristotle of the peripatetic and Neoplatonic commentators, they took the conviction that the gap between the phenomena and the essences can be bridged by demonstration based upon the first premises implanted in the human mind, implanted in the human reason from its first inception, and helped by the agent intellect, the famous metaphysical gadget derived from Aristotle's book on the soul, and identified by the Neoplatonists with Plato's demiurge, the presence of the divine and unchangeable in the human mind. This essence of Platonism was transmitted, or rather was living on, in the ethical propedeutic and the mathematical isagoge of the late Hellenistic schools, evident from the extant testimonia of the curriculum of the School of Alexandria and its Arabic offshoots. Its object was explored throughout on the basis of the works of Aristotle. Aristotle's logic, physics, and metaphysics, the doctrine of being qua being. On the other hand, the authority of leadership of the philosopher leading the only way of life ensuing in perfect happiness rests with Plato. The Platonic one and first good is the highest object of knowledge, and attainment of this knowledge is the way to true happiness. With the Alexandrian commentators of Aristotle, the unique principle pursued in the philosophy of Aristotle is none other than the Neoplatonic one. In the face of the society and of the institutions of the Christian empire, the authority of Aristotle, sustained by this harmonizing tendency, grew all the more important. Even so, the Platonic theology continued as the religion of the intellectuals. Under the name of Aristotle, who had become the master of demonstrative discourse, in harmony with the tradition transmitted and elaborated by the commentators, enhanced by the Gnostic elements of popular religion. Now the Res Publica, and this is the political legacy Neoplatonism took from Plato, is the place where humankind must make its departure towards ultimate bliss, and in the final analysis toward assimilation to God. The life of humans in the political community makes way to the preparation of the rational soul, while in its bodily existence to conform to the intelligible principles of the celestial and physical hierarchy, guided by the philosophers who imitate the divine forms in assuming political functions, shaping the community in accordance with the divine paradigm. In extremis, however, the philosopher would complain that the vita philosophica was impossible in a depraved city, as Simplicius did after the closing down of the academy by the Christian emperor in his commentary on Epictetus's Enchiridion. Ethical texts from the Gnomologia of ancient wisdom, but also texts from the standard propedeutics of ethical instruction, surviving great numbers in the Arabic tradition, such as the Pythagorean Karmanaurium, along with its Neoplatonic commentaries. Now our question is, whoever read, whoever took seriously, or even put to task such writings of the Greeks and of their Arabic heirs, receiving them in the baggage of specific social and professional groups of scientists and physicians. Let us dive into the world of the past made alive by one of the most remarkable historians of his age, the Iranian Mishkawayh, taking us back to 10th century Iraq and Western Iran. It is a century of turmoil, of polarization between political and religious factions, of transgressing borders visible and invisible. The Arabic Caliph, after lengthy struggles between Arabic, Turkish and Turkic armies and militias, lost his sovereignty even over Mesopotamia when an Iranian emir from the Buyid family of Condottieri of northern Iran invaded the country and took Baghdad, saving the caliph from dire straits. But although he confirmed the caliph in his office, the caliphate was to be deprived of effective power for decades. The Buyids were Shiites, acknowledging Ali and his successors as rightful imams of the Muslim community, but they needed the Abbasid caliph to have conferred on them the token of legitimacy. The political function of the caliph was heretofore limited to serve the claims and the commands of the emir as the representative of the religious law. He, the caliph, was to invest the Buyid prince with a cloak of legitimacy and to confer upon him the actual control. Under the emirate of Adad ad-Dawla, the greatest ruler of the dynasty, all western Iran and the Iraq fell into one hand in 977. Through his power and authority, he succeeded in conferring upon himself the title and dignity of King of Kings, Shah al-Shah, crowned by the caliph himself with all due ceremony. The same ruler employed the theoreticians of Imamite Shiism who justified their political quietism as well as their legal authority with the absconsion of the hidden imam. Thus, for a short period, two worlds united, the Sasanian Persian and the Muslim Arab caliph and great king. Now in the year 1970, the courtier, historian and philosopher Abu Ali Miskawayh laments the death of a man, vizier of the Buyid Amir Rukn ad-Dawla. With him, excellence in the fullest sense disappeared. Virtues which had been united in no one else in Islam passed away. The talents and virtues which this man displayed were of a sort that made him outshine his contemporaries that the enemy could not resist or the envious failed to acknowledge. No one rivaled his combination of qualities. He was like the sun which is hidden from no one, or the sea about which one may talk without restraint. He's the only person whom I ever saw, says Miskawayh, whose presence outdid his report. For example, he was the best clerk of his time and possessed the greatest number of professional attainments, command of the Arabic language with its rarities, familiarity with grammar and prosody, felicity in etymology and metaphor, retention by memory of pre-Islamic and Islamic collections of poems. Miskawayh goes on to praise his excellence as an epistolographer, as a poet familiar with all the disciplines of the Arabic language, with Quranic exegesis and Muslim jurisprudence. But then he was at home in both worlds, the world of Arabic Islamic erudition and the world of the rational sciences inherited from the Greeks, logic, philosophy, and the applied sciences indispensable for administration and statecraft. I go on quoting Miskawayh. When he took to mechanics and mathematics, there was no one to approach him in them. As for logic, the various branches of philosophy and especially metaphysics, no contemporary venture to profess them in his presence unless he came to acquire information or aimed at learning rather than discussing. I myself saw at his court Abu Hassan al-Amiri, who had journeyed from Khurasan to Baghdad and was on his way home, deeming himself an accomplished philosopher. Having commented on the works of Aristotle wherein he had grown old, but when he got insight into the attainments of the chief Ustad, that is the Vizier Ibn al-Abid, and became conscious of their vastness, of the brilliancy of his acumen, and of the accuracy wherewith he remembered what was written, he bowed down before him, recommenced his studies under him, and regarded himself as only fit to be his disciple. He read many difficult books with the chief Ustad, who expounded them to him and enabled him to learn their contents. Such then was his proficiency in recognized studies and sciences. In addition, he was so master of the secrets of certain obscure sciences which no one professes, such as mechanics, requiring the most intricate knowledge of geometry and physics, the science of abnormal motion, the dragging of heavy weights and of centers of gravity, including the execution of many operations which the ancients found impossible, the fabrication of wonderful engines for the storming of fortresses, stratagems against strongholds and stratagems in campaigns, the adoption of wonderful weapons such as arrows which could permeate a vast space and produce remarkable effects, mirrors which burned a very long way off, unheard of sleight of hand, knowledge of the refinements of the art of modeling, and ingenuity in the application of it. And again, his capacity as an administrator, as an organizer of agriculture, as a fertilizer of revenue, is indicated by his epistle to Ibn Hindu, another physician, philosopher, courtier, wherein he describes the disorder of the affairs of Fars, the mismanagement of his predecessor there, and the expedients necessary in order to restore it to its condition when it was at its best. From this epistle it is possible to learn the whole duty of a vizier and how to restore a realm after it has been utterly ruined. Miskabeh goes on to praise his excellency as a warrior and as an administrator and also as a scholar and philosopher, and concludes, some reader of this section of my book who did not witness his career may imagine that I have been gratuitously eulogizing, claiming for him more than the real extent of his attainments and hate of his virtues. I swear by him who bade us utter the truth and forbade us to say anything else that it is not so. The historian, who with such words extols the character and erudition of the Vizier Abul Fadl ibn al-Amid, Vizier to the Buyid Rukn al-Dawla and tutor of his son and successor, Adul al-Dawla, who was to become the greatest of the dynasty, as the Iranian courtier, historian and philosopher Abu Ali Miskabeh, as a librarian at the Buyid residence of Rai in northern Iran. He became intimately familiar with the powerful vizier whose virtue and learning he depicts as a living example of the education commended in his own book on ethics. A man who had encompassing the twofold encyclopedia, the religious hermeneutical disciplines, and the rational sciences of the Greek tradition. His chronicle, from which I quoted, entitled Tajarib al-Ummah, the experiences of the peoples, explores the history of the Muslim dynasties and especially of those of contemporary Iraq and Iran as a source of instruction on, and I quote, useful experiences among those things that continue to recur and happenings the like of which may be expected again, like the beginnings of dynasties and the rise of kingdoms and the occurrence of calamities, and how those who corrected and repaired their situation returned to the best of states, and how those who neglected and spurned amendments came to dwindle and vanish. As a moral philosopher, Miskabeh followed the tradition of the rational sciences notably those of the mathematicians, astronomers, and learned physicians who, since the rise of the Abbasid dynasty of Baghdad, had entered the service of the Arabic Islamic administration, and who, along with the progress of Arabization and Islamization of Near Eastern society, propagated their activity as a service to the foundations of the Islamic community, vindicating philosophical instruction, the doctrines of the Greek philosopher, on God, the world, and humanity as a universal demonstration of the truth of the revelation. In the school of Al-Kindi, the most important precursor of the first half of the 9th century, precursor and authority of Miskawayh's thought, models of Platonic cosmology and theology were amalgamated with Gnostic Neoplatonic doctrines of the soul. The highest destiny of the human genus, constituted by corporeal matter, informed by the immaterial soul, is presented as an ascent to the upper world of intellect, and derives from this final goal the sanction of ethics, this noblest of the arts. In this way, philosophy may show the way to ultimate happiness through the refinement of the substantial immaterial form, the ahilon eidos, of soul, not in need of a body, for its subsistence and perfection through rational activity. A distinctive tenet of the philosophical creed of this milieu is the purification of the soul, proclaimed as a condition for entering the upper world of pure intellect, whence it descended in the first place, and to attain the visio beatifica of the beyond, which is the greatest reward of all human efforts, the ultimate felicity. This is in clear continuity with the traditions of Al-Kindi, who in the early 9th century, along with translations of Aristotle's cosmology and metaphysics, had commissioned and reworked the Arabic Plotinus, the theology of Aristotle. The Platonic theology of Miskawayh can be followed up not only to such general tenets of his precursor, but more specifically to the Greek sources translated and paraphrased and commented upon in the milieu of Al-Kindi, the sources of Arabic Neoplatonism put forward in an Aristotelian conceptualization going back to the Alexandrian commentators. As in the corpus of Plotinian and Proclean texts transmitted as parts of an Aristotelian theology, the Neoplatonic cosmology is given an interpretation in harmony with the monotheist and creationist theology. The first principle, the pure good, is at the same time the first intellect, nous, noon, noeton, with Aristotle's metaphysics, Lambda 7. In Miskawayh's metaphysical diatribe on happiness, Al-Fawz al-Asghar, dedicated to none other than the Emir Adad ad-Dawla, the immortality of the rational soul, along with the topics of divinity and prophecy, is treated using the traditional argument of the Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition, and quoting at length Proclus's treatise, 3 Proofs for the Immortality of the Soul. In Miskawayh, this philosophical theology is built upon a systematic foundation of Aristotelian epistemology, physics, and positive ethics, supplemented also by the anthropology of Galen. This is the tradition of the ethical propedeutic, the way to happiness signaled in the Neoplatonic schools of Athens and Alexandria, as leading to the purification of the soul and hence to the ultimate bliss. This way is prepared by the study of the rational sciences on the basis of an Aristotelian canon, and in the end leading to knowledge of the good, according to the Platonic theology. The supreme beatitude will be realized when the highest grade of knowledge is attained. At this stage, the intellect will be identical with the first intelligibles, and the active man at this high stage of perfection will be divine. His essence will be identical with his acts, and will be acting for the sake of his divine nature. Now, this highest grade can be attained only by those who have studied all parts of philosophy, the practical and the theoretical, exhaustively. To this, Aristotle has shown the way in his books on logic, the way towards true judgment and the methods for persuading others to pursue the good, and in his books on ethics, the disposition of the soul for the attainment of happiness and the states and degrees thereof. The counsel of the wise leads to happiness through knowledge of the true essences, and from this to doing right. Accordingly, two classes of knowledge, theoretical and practical, wisdom, are leading the way to the perfection of humanity, insania, humanness, and to the realization of the ethos of man or of human nature. In this way, the ethical component of this wisdom, hikmah, the autonomous ethics of the philosopher, who finds in the encyclopedia of sciences the instruction for educating his soul, is found again in the Tahdhib al-Akhlaq, the refinement of character or purification of moral dispositions of our historian, Miskawayh. Aristotelian, in many details of ethical categorization and substance, as also a work of his older contemporary, the Christian Yahya ibn Adi, bearing the same title, is based on the same Platonic view of the rational soul and its a priori knowledge, a view which outlasted the critique of the Greek and Arabic peripatetics. The true pleasures of the soul are those of the intellect, which are not of this material world but found in the pure rationality of the sciences. This ideology of the Platonic scientists ignores the aporia of the closing chapter of the Analytica Posteriora, rejects the naturalism of the Galenists, as shown in a vehement refutation of the 2nd century physician Rufus in Miskawayh's treatise on the soul and intellect. Since the soul is distinct from the body in substance, judgments, properties and actions, the soul's desire for its own actions, for the sciences and the forms of knowledge, as well as its flight away from the actions proper to the body, constitute its virtue. As a being endowed with reason, man should seek virtue in his rational soul, the soul by which he is become man. The way to intellectual perfection is outlined in the Encyclopedia of the Sciences, sketched by Miskawayh in the tradition of his predecessors under the programmatic title Tartib al-Ulum wa Tartib al-Sa'adat, the grades of the sciences and the grades of happinesses, written in quest of and dedicated to the Vizier Abul Fadl ibn al-Amid. These ranks of virtues through which the completely happy man progresses cannot be achieved until he has acquired a sound knowledge of all the parts of philosophy and mastered them gradually in the order which we set forth in our work, The Order of the Happinesses. Whoever thinks that he can attain them by any other method or any other plan has judged falsely and deviated very far from the truth. The only Arabic Islamic author referred to in the Tahdhib is Al-Kindi, and it was Al-Kindi's concept of philosophy as an autonomous way of thought and way of life, albeit in the service of the Muslim community and compatible with the Quranic revelation, which stayed alive in the circles of hukama, of scientists, of learned courtiers, and of physicians who, in the spirit of Galen's Platonism, revered in philosophy the healing art of the soul. Ibn Hindu, mentioned in Miskawayh's obituary of the Vizier as a recipient of his epistle on the state of the realm, is another such learned courtier, physician, and philosopher. Now, a principal feature of the philosopher of this milieu, and at the very fore of the debate, is the conviction that the rationalism of philosophy and the subordinate sciences is in accordance with the revealed law, as long as it will not exceed its realm of competence. The proof of this principle serves in its turn to defend philosophy vis-à-vis the religious community. The most detailed contemporary attempt to determine the relation of the religious and the philosophic cycles of knowledge in a harmonious symmetry is a book entitled Propagation of the Excellences of Islam, I'Lam bi Manaqib al-Islam, of a man of the name Abul Hassan al-Amri, who died in Nishapur in eastern Iran in 992, a student of Abu Zaid of Balkh, Transoxania, of Khorasan, who had brought al-Kindi's heritage to the east. The very title, Propagation of the Excellences of Islam, is an apologetic program. The rational sciences are put into the service of Islam, the absolute religion, and of the religious sciences. Both spheres, and I quote, are based on tenets which agree with pure reason and are supported by valid demonstration. Insight into the true essences, the scope of philosophy, in al-Kindi's traditional definition of philosophy, will show the way to perfect human virtue and will reveal the wisdom of the Creator. But the ultimate superiority of prophecy over philosophy is uncontested. Every prophet is a hakim, wise philosopher, but not every hakim is a prophet. But wasn't philosophy assuming, as indeed it did in al-Kindi's ideology, the role of a religion for intellectuals, universal, absolute, and transgressing the limits of reason, headed for confrontation with the religious institutions of Islam? We remember Miskawayh's malicious report on al-Amiri's rebuff in the majlis, in the circle of Ibn al-Hamid. But let us look at what another reporter, Miskawayh's older contemporary, Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi, at times his friend and a masterful reporter of the intellectual debates of his age, has to say on this development. Tawhidi, because he shaped philosophical discourse and according to the ideals of adab, of beautiful Arabic literary prose, he was called Adib al-Falasifa, the littérateur among the philosophers. The first document of this, of Tawhidi's adab, had been his philosophical correspondence with Miskawayh, a series of questions and answers, going back to the time when he met him in Shiraz. It is a unique document apart from the school tradition and the neat pigeonholes of its topics. Its title is Al-Hawamil wa Shawamil, vagrant sheep, and paling enclosures, that is, questions uttered at random and given full answers, like stray sheep were put into the fold. An exchange of questions, some of them more remarkable than the replies, questions submitted by Tawhidi and of answers given by Miskawayh. I'm quoting a few examples. Question: is it conceded to man to comprise all the sciences, with all their disciplines and methods, and taking regard of the differences of language in them, and the ways of expression in them? And if it is possible, is it necessary? And if necessary, does it ever exist? And if it ever exists, has it become known to exist? Another question: when the soul leaves the body, will it remember something of the knowledge, of the knowledges it had or not? And what about knowledge conditioned and impaired by deficiencies of the body? It is the well-known topic also occurring in the Theology of Aristotle of the soul's anamnesis, the collection of what it had in the upper world of intellect. And finally, one more question. It is a long series of more than 100. What is the desire of the soul in this world? Indeed, does it have a desire or wish? Does soul subsist by man? Or does man subsist by the soul? What is the relation of soul to man? And ending up on a note of resignation, Tawhidi concludes this question: indeed, man is difficult for man. The human being is difficult. Man is an enigma to man. فَإِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ أَشْكَلَ عَلَيْهِ الْإِنسَانِ. Now, on the one hand, Tawhidi intervened with provoking questions. On the other hand, Tawhidi fashioned philosophic discourse into the shape of literary creation, and he portrayed the personalities behind the doctrines. It was Tawhidi who presented to the reader of his time the educated secretary, the learned amanuensis, the Muslim judge and theologian, the physician and the astrologer, philosophy as literature, clad in the ornate garment of high-flown style, and thus made palatable to the expectations and tastes of such readers. And so giving sort of an answer to our initial questions: who ever read that stuff? It is true that in his play with language and his play on words, Tawhidi imperceptibly crosses the boundary into fiction. It is Tawhidi who has reported the answers given by the man who may be called the opinion leader of the most influential philosophical circles of Baghdad in his time, after the death of Yahya ibn Adi, the great Christian Arabic philosopher and theologian, the man who, together with his disciples, recited on the death of the Emir Adud ad-Dawla the sayings which the sages had pronounced 13 centuries before at the grave of Alexander the Great. Thus not only paying homage to the great Buyid prince, but also proclaiming the eternal and universal validity of their teaching, not only teaching history, but extolling the archetype of the wise king, whose legend had left traces even in the Quran, instructed by Aristotle, the first teacher of philosophy. It is this man, his name is Abu Sulaiman, called a Sijistani, and the man from Sistan, Sijistan, also called Al-Mantiqi, the logician, a pupil of the Christian philosopher and theologian Yahya ibn Adi, who had passed away in 974. To his learning, wisdom and piety, Tawhidi pays continual tribute, who more than anyone else is responsible for the attitude towards philosophy which pervades his writings. This attitude does not differ much in many regards from the established tenets of the school. The apotheosis of reason is omnipresent. Reason is the caliph, representative of God in this world, an allusion to a Quranic sayings calling Adam, the first human, as God's caliph in this world. So it is not just Adam, it is the reasonable man who truly represents God in this world. This is quoted by Tawhidi as a saying of Al-Amiri, Abul Hassan Al-Amiri, whom I mentioned before. And this is confirmed by Al-Amiri's book, The Adjournment to Eternity, a philosophical, Neoplatonic and diatribe on the eternity of the soul, or the immortality of the soul. But Abu Sulaiman, At-Tawhidi's Abu Sulaiman, we should say, also insists that there are limits to it. It is he who is quoted as saying that man's mind cannot escape the limitations of his natural abode, his garment of matter, unless God clothes him with the garment of mercy and covers him with a coat of purity. Ultimate wisdom is granted by God through an act of grace, and God will refuse the light of knowledge. He will even ordain him to be wrong, as, for example, in astrology, if he thinks so best. He, God, has no companion in his seclusion. The philosophical conversations of these circles in the shops of learned copyists and booksellers on the Souq al-Waraqin of Baghdad, or in the majalis, the discussion circles of the viziers in Baghdad, Isfahan, and Shiraz, are impregnated by the metaphysics of the intellect. The Platonic Geistmetaphysik, to use Kramer's expression, and the ethics of knowledge. Here, Socrates, according to Tawhidi, affirms that the soul feels a nostalgia toward the noble ideas because there is its true home, while in this world it feels a stranger, since man is human by his soul alone. Plato proclaims the voluntary death as the philosopher's aim, commented by Tawhidi, as also by Miskawayh in his Ethics. According to the traditional propedeutic, the voluntary death consists in subjugating the destructive appetites. Thanks to this condition, the reasonable soul will be prepared to acquire the states of divine perfection. The debates reported by Tawhidi between philosophers and theologians, teachers of logic and grammar, demonstrative science and ascetic wisdom, bear testimony to a deep conflict about authority between the groups and institutions of Arabic Islamic society at the time of the eclipse of the Abbasid Caliphate, the English title given by the English translator Magoliath to Miskawayh's chronicle of those years. The foundation of ethics is a case in point. Yearning for the ultimate bliss of the hereafter meant putting off the fulfillment of philosophy to the beyond. Guarding truth and justice in the here and now required demonstrative science based on sound reasoning alone and put to task in the service of the community. To the demonstrative, but to the optimistic and irenic view of Tawhidi's circle of secretaries, courtiers, and Christian Aristotelians concerning the role and value of philosophy in the religious community, Al-Farabi's concept, Farabi's concept of principles of the views of the people of the virtuous city offered a very serious challenge. It is interesting to note that Al-Farabi, the famous philosopher, who had redefined philosophy as demonstrative science, is scarcely ever mentioned among the Baghdadi intellectuals, some of whom had been his disciples after his death in 950. If the theology of the philosophers could not admit to the singular, transcendent rank of the truth conveyed through the revelation of the Prophet Muhammad, the theology of the Ahl Sunnah, in its turn, the traditionalist jurists, would not forfeit its universal claim. The philosophy would not give up its pretense for unmediated knowledge and for the attainment of true felicity by philosophy alone, making Burhan its ultimate judge, the syllogistic proof, jurisprudence would not forfeit its competence for the definition of orthodoxy. Indeed, among the ignorant states to be distinguished from Al-Farabi's ideal city is a state whose citizens believe, and I quote, that the union of body and soul is not natural, that man is but soul, that the union of the body with the soul corrupts and perverts his actions, and that the vices ensue from this union with the body, and that the soul's perfection consists in its delivery from the body. Isn't this an open indictment of the Gnostic Neoplatonism of Al-Kindi and his sources? According to Al-Farabi, only the philosopher could establish this order and could guard it once it was threatened by corruption. Even in this career, we can perceive reservations against an all too rigid interpretation of the exemplum Socrates, the Platonic meditatio mortis, directed exclusively towards the beyond, and vanguards of the rising polemic, announcing the apparition of a new school of falsafa. This polemic had been entered resolutely by Al-Farabi and his followers among the philosophers who considered the spirit united with the body, the soul in the Aristotelian definition, the essence of humankind, who assigned to philosophy, conceived as a demonstrative science, a principal role in the community, and who would not deprive the human being in the here and now of the supreme felicity, which is the entelechy of humankind in the city of men. But thus Al-Farabi's concept was inadmissible for the philosophers who wanted to live quietly in the Islamic community without giving offense, which might prove dangerous. Although Al-Farabi is not named explicitly, Abu Sulaiman as-Sijistani comments on the pretenses of Al-Amiri, along with Al-Balqi, his teacher. It seems like direct disavowals put forward by a philosopher who would not be seen in bad company. The philosophy found acceptable in many of these circles of intellectuals, both Christian and Muslims, scientists and courtiers, was not a philosophy assuming the prerogative of definition in the religious community. The most explicit and most significant statement on this attitude is found in Tawhidi's report on what Abu Sulaiman and other spokesmen of his circle had to say on the presumptions of a group of Shiite intellectuals of Basra, who call themselves the Brethren of Purity, Ikhwan al-Safa, Brethren in the Pure Faith. Their doctrine is transmitted in an important philosophical, theological encyclopedia, which, by the way, shows a permeating influence of the Neoplatonism of the so-called Theology of Aristotle. The report is given by Abu Hayyan to the Vizier Ibn Sa'dan in the early 70s of the 9th century, in one of their nightly conversations in the early 70s of the 10th century. What do you think, Abu Sulaiman was asked, about these men who claim that religion is soiled with ignorance and polluted with error, and that there's no way to clean and purify it but through philosophy, who want to smuggle philosophy into religion and to unite religion with philosophy? The answer of Abu Sulaiman is the most vehement repudiation of philosophy's claim to absolute transcendent knowledge ever pronounced by a Muslim philosopher before Al-Ghazali. Reason, he says, is not self-sufficient. If it were, revelation would be useless. Religion has access to the intelligible world as well as philosophy, but philosophy has no access to revelation. Philosophy is the work of man, doubtful and arbitrary. The light of the intellect is uncertain, but the light of revelation gives true guidance. Not the logic of the Greeks, but revelation is the true apodoxis. Therefore, the prophet is superior to the philosopher. You assert, he says, that the message of religion and philosophy is one, converging onto the same truth. Why do not Muslim, Jewish and Christian philosophers overcome the differences of their creeds? And thus Abu Sulaiman attacks sharply every attempt to vindicate religious law for philosophy. Not harmony, but delimitation is his aim. Not only the brethren, but also other Muslim thinkers who try to harmonize religion with philosophy are attacked. Among them Al-Amiri. Al-Farabi is not mentioned by name, but one of the tenets denounced is well nigh a quote, the verbatim borrowings from his views of the citizens of the perfect state in the Encyclopedia of the Brethren were in a clause from the long side. The vizier to whom Tawhidi tells all this is amazed by Tawhidi's report. Why does this man disavow his own science? A man who is called Al-Mantiqi, the logician, who was the ghulam, the famulus of the Christian Aristotelian Yahya ibn Adi, with whom he studied the Greek books and interpreted their subtleties. Tawhidi admits that there are strong objections to this attitude. It seemed inconsistent. And the standing of philosophy in Muslim society was at stake. It is strange indeed how philosophy is disclaimed here by a philosopher, but to Abu Sulaiman, these authors seem to have represented all those groups of Shiite Islam who endeavored to make philosophy in the widest sense, including all the sciences of the Hellenistic legacy, mathematical, astrological, served their own ends, who employed the Neoplatonic concepts of progression and reversion, and of cosmic sympathy, and the Gnostic idea of the intellect as evidence for the perpetuation of prophecy or prophetical inspiration through the chosen imams, who devaluated thereby the singular act of mercy which had been God's sending of the Prophet Muhammad, and who by their esotericism, by their pretension to have insight into the inner meaning of being and of the word of the scripture, inaccessible to the common man, evaluated the Sharia, the revealed law, as interpreted by the tradition and the consensus of the Muslim community. They may also have represented in his eyes the intellectual background of the growing, virulent, and as not only the recent conquest of Egypt by the Fatimids had shown, politically dangerous sects of Ismaili Shiism who did not hesitate to pursue their claims through military action. This is of course conjecture, but I think we may suppose that Abu Sulaiman's critique, and also Tawhidi's making it public, arose from well-founded apprehensions regarding the religious, moral, and finally political implications of philosophy, which was to be more than an object of contemplation and edification, which was apt to shake the very foundations of state and society. Tawhidi himself, of course, regarded the universal ethics of the philosophers not as an abrogation of the Greek law, but representing its universal foundation, as confirming it. He was also convinced that the philosopher, the sage, the hakim, we would say the intellectual, should advise the leaders of the religious and political community, and that the politician was in need of such advice. But he also learned through his own experiences that such efforts were in vain. In an unstable balance of power, the rulers had ceased to reflect on the foundations of legitimate and stable authority. The Buyid Vizier, Tawhidi's vis-a-vis, Ibn Sa'dan, defends instead of the Platonic philosopher king, the old Iranian tenet ascribed to the Sasanian king Al-Jashir, familiar law of the Persian Arabic wisdom literature, repeated in many a book of Islamic ethics. Religion and kingship are brethren. Religion is the foundation, kingship is the guardian. What has no foundation will collapse, and what has no guardian will perish. Tawhidi in his rejoinder commends the Islamic principle of the theocracy, not only the Prophet, but also the succeeding rulers, the Caliph, that is, representatives of the Prophet, execute God's law in his creation, are appointed by God. The critique of the situation which had arisen under the Buyid is evident, but the answer to the opening question, the question of the stance of philosophy in the Islamic community, is left open. To Tawhidi, the unrest of inquiry matters more than the accepted answer, the coexistence of opinions more than the peremptory decision. But wasn't that basic attitude of the philosophers of Al-Kindi's school, this Platonic ethics, this Gnostic craving for the world of intellect, leaving behind the here and now, this fascination with style, setting form above content? Wasn't it an expression of esotericism, quietism, even escapism? What remained to be done after the theocrat was bereft of power and the wielder of power shirked the divine mission to rule for the benefit of his subjects? Abu Hayyan depicts to the vizier events which he himself had lived through in sorrow and need, the events after the Byzantine invasion of 972, when riots shook the capital, Baghdad, when Tawhidi himself lost all his belongings. Miskawayh, in his chronicle, reports how the masses assaulted the Caliphal palace, demanding the holy war against Byzantium, telling the Caliph that he was incompetent to discharge the duties which God had enjoined upon the Imams. But the Caliph lacked power and means. Meanwhile, the Buyid Amir, Isa Dawla Bakhtiyar, stayed in Kufa, ostensibly to visit the shrine of the Martyrium, in point of fact to go hunting. But Tawhidi tells more. Our group of judges and scholars set out to remonstrate with the Amir for his neglect and to represent to him the woes and distresses of the population. If we had a caliph, these were the leading men of Baghdad, the leading scientists, philosophers, courtiers, sent a large delegation in order to remonstrate with him in light of his neglect of interest of the Muslims. If we had a caliph, one of them addressed him, if we had a caliph, if we had a prince or another authority to take charge, this infamous predicament would not have arisen. Surely the caliph gave him power over the land beyond his door, so that he should watch over it by night and care for the welfare of his flock, and should issue commands and prohibitions which might put the religion in the right way and serve the profit of all subjects near or far. But if not, there is no obedience. The delegation pleads and implores, if you should take the lead, addressing the Amir Bakhtiyar, exhausted as we are, as you can see, incapable of turning a stick in our hands or throwing a pebble with our arms, knowing weapons only by name, we should rise and rally under your banner. If we may believe Tawhidi, the Amir not only failed, as did the Caliph before him in the face of affliction from without and within, but he also refused to accept a special responsibility as a prince and politician for the fate of the community. You think, the Amir addresses the delegation, you think that you suffer injustice under my rule and my attention to your affairs? Not at all. Rather, as you are, you should be ruled. Thus speaketh the lawgiver of our religion about us and about you. By God, if you were not like me, I should not rule over you. If I were not like one of you, I would not have been appointed your Lord. So Bakhtiyar turned away the delegation with abuses and personal defamations. We know that he returned to Baghdad and that he and others demanded and obtained means against Byzantium, but the soldiery, thus equipped, unleashed a civil war of all against all, while the warlords, the militias took command in the quarters of Baghdad. In the end, the capital lay in ruins. Possessions were looted, fighting among the people continued every day until it was not counteracted and could not be terminated, and the lack of respect for the state authority, a sultan, and its weakness became manifest. Abu Hayyan pursued his task as an instructor and advisor, not as a utopian, but in the face of failure, while he admonished the vizier to shoot the right counselors, to lend his ears to the learned, and the while the retreat of Muslim society under the protection of unfailing authority, the authority of the traditionalist school of law, had already begun in the face of the fundamental and incontrovertible evidence of the religion and the urge for unity, the unity of orthodoxy. Philosophy was relegated to the place of an outsider. Soon the attacks of intransigent orthodoxy ended a dialogue which had scarcely begun, to be taken up, but under very different circumstances. Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi, perhaps because of his failure to reach the attention of the powerful like no one else, was conscious of the deep intellectual crisis of his time, a crisis described by his younger contemporary as a history of moral failure and political corruption. Both examples of the clairvoyance of the owl flying by night, as in Hegel's Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel's dictum, only in the fullness of reality, the idea appears in the face of the real, both the same world conceived in its substance in the shape of an intellectual realm, and philosophy paints its grey in grey. Then one shape of life has grown old, and by such grey in grey this cannot be resuscitated, but can only be recognized only by the fall of dusk. The owl of Minerva sets out on its flight. Perhaps I should repeat this in German. Noch über das Belehren, wie die Welt sein sollte, ein Wort zu sagen, so kommt dazu ohnehin die Philosophie immer zu spät. Als der Gedanke der Welt erscheint sie erst in der Zeit, nachdem die Wirklichkeit ihren Bildungsprozess vollendet und sich fertig gemacht hat. Dies, was der Begriff lehrt, zeigt notwendig ebenso die Geschichte, dass erst in der Reife der Wirklichkeit das Ideale dem Realen gegenüber erscheint und jenes sich dieselbe Welt in ihrer Substanz erfasst in Gestalt eines intellektuellen Reichs erbaut. Wenn die Philosophie ihr Grau in Grau malt, dann ist eine Gestalt des Lebens alt geworden, und mit Grau und Grau lässt sie sich nicht verjüngen, sondern nur erkennen. Die Eule der Minerva beginnt erst mit der einbrechenden Dämmerung, ihrem Flug. So, is it all too late? He seems to have thought it was, but still kept his optimism. So should we. Thank you.
Grazie. Come sempre siamo stati guidati in un cammino molto complesso e molto importante per noi. È vero, siamo solo degli storici della filosofia, la sola cosa che sappiamo fare è cercare di fare rinascere un passato di cui avete potuto percepire, anche se non seguire forse nei dettagli, la grande complessità e la grande avventura della filosofia nel mondo arabo-musulmano, con le sue sfide, la competizione per il primato intellettuale, la fine che sembra essere irreversibile del momento nel quale l'intellettualità musulmana ha considerato il pensiero greco come qualcosa di desiderabile e che poteva essere assimilato, e la speranza finale è che si creino le condizioni per le quali possiamo ricostruire questa comunità epistemica della quale ci ha parlato Gerhard Endress. Naturalmente siamo uomini del nostro tempo e adesso abbiamo molti strumenti anche più nuovi quanto non accadeva nei secoli passati, per ricreare questa comunità epistemia. E una sorta di lingua franca universale sembra essere quella che ci è fornita appunto dai moderni strumenti di comunicazione globale, su un punto molto di dettaglio, non su uno scenario molto vasto, ma è su un punto molto di dettaglio che noi facciamo questo. Noi cerchiamo di utilizzare questa sorta di lingua franca globale per fare parlare tra di loro testi del passato scritti in alfabeti non latini, testi greci e testi arabi.